Hey, this is Joe. Maybe I'll start calling these kinds of videos layman's ramblings. This is kind of related to the WordPress that I have, but basically, this is just going to be a stream of conscience video inspired a little bit by some thoughts I've had while watching Paul Vanderklay videos. Paul Vanderklay is a great YouTuber. If you don't know who he is, go check him out. He does a lot of these kind of stream of conscience videos that I'm about to do, where he talks about topics that are kind of in the ethos, in the ether, culturally with kind of Christians, and he has lots of videos where he talks about the Christian Reformed Church. He's a minister in the CRCNA, which is a kind of smallish, I'll say, but not that small. Well, it's kind of a denomination that's been around for a long time that's been servicing specifically the Dutch American community. They're kind of mainline. They're kind of evangelical. A lot of his videos have to do with the kind of tension between those two factions in their church. So it's interesting to kind of juxtapose the CRC, the Christian Reformed Church, and a lot of the stuff he talks about there with the ACNA, which is my context. And I point this out in a comment. I said, I'm not Christian Reformed Church, but the Anglican Church in North America is around the same size. We actually have fewer congregations, but more congregants. If you look up, or I think average Sunday attendance is actually higher for us. We've had about 80,000 average Sunday attendance pretty stagnantly for about 10 years, which, you might say, oh, the ACNA is stagnant. That's not great. But we're actually doing more church plants and stuff. And compared to most church denominations, actually, like the LCMS, which is by far not going plummeting as fast as the mainline churches, there's a kind of trickling downward. The CRC is similar. A lot of these older, still conservative, in some sense, Protestant denominations, classical Protestant denominations, are kind of trickling, whereas the ACNA is remaining at mass at about 80,000. There's been a slight recovery from COVID. Obviously, COVID damaged Sunday attendance, but the ACNA has rebounded. And if you talk to any ministers or people that talk kind of organizational level for the Anglican Church North America, there's a lot of pride in the fact that we've rebounded. But again, it's still actually really kind of just keeping pace with 80,000. So you can say that's good or that's bad or whatever. But it's interesting because I have a lot of these thoughts about the denomination. If you've seen my Reconquista video, I'm thinking about what is Anglicanism and in North America, what's the place of the ACNA, what's the future of the ACNA going to look like, and I think, okay, it's interesting because if you compare the CRC, it's kind of in this weird space where they're a kind of conservative denomination, have a lot of overlap with evangelicals, but from what I understand, they allow the ordination of women. Okay, that's similar to the Lutheran equivalent of that. There's this kind of space for that, which is what's called the North American Lutheran Church, NALC, or whatever, which is pretty close to the ACNA, which is in a similar spot. But diocese by diocese, there is obviously places in the ACNA where it's interesting because most of the time in church history, and we'll talk about this with the reply I got in this comment, if the denomination starts to allow women's ordination, it starts a kind of slippery slope. And then eventually it's impossible to have a diocese that doesn't ordain women. But the ACNA is weird in that we actually kind of have been sitting in this spot where some dioceses ordain women and others don't even recognize their holy orders of those priests. And so there's that tension there. The CRC is actually similar, and he points this out, is that they allowed the ordination of women. Everyone thought they were going to kind of go on this downslide, and progressives in the denomination had an outsized voice. So to the point where they thought they might start allowing gay marriage in the Christian Reformed Church. But then when it actually came down to vote, the denomination like handily rejected gay marriage and has definitely and Paul Vanderklay talks a lot about this kind of shift towards the evangelical association for the Christian Reformed Church, so that they're more aligned with evangelicals who would more broadly deny same-sex marriage. Okay, but the reason I put this up here is there's a little comment on my comment that I thought was super interesting, and it's this person who points out it is interesting that the ACNA is quite a bit more conservative than the Christian Reformed Church. I wouldn't have expected that a decade ago or so. There's this weirdness I think that a lot of people are noticing where it does. I think people I think people are reluctant to point out, or when people do point out, they think it's attributed to some kind of bias. But there is definitely a more traditional revival in the Anglican space in America. And you can look at that in two different ways. One way you can look at is within the Anglican Church in North America, or even the Episcopal Church, there's a growing wing of traditionalists. They're becoming more vocal, they're becoming more representative. I mean, I would just say, like, look at the most successful Anglican podcast on Spotify or whatever. They're from kind of traditional, even Anglo-Catholic leaning Anglicans for the most part. I'm thinking of the Sacramentalist podcast. I'm thinking of Appalachian Anglican. I'm thinking of, I mean, even Minding the Mysteries, which is literally associated with the Anglo continuing church, right? What else? There are lots of podcasts that are more conservative, and I think that you can see this kind of trend that way, and people are noticing it because it's like, in a weird way, it's beating all of the trend ideas. It's beating the narrative, which is that, like, ambiguity on this will trend one way. I think always of the response to Calvin Robinson. So, like, 10 years ago when the ACNA was founded, there was this idea that, oh, we'll just kind of live and let live women's ordination here, no women's ordination in these dioceses. And then, you know, anyone who kind of questions that situation, it's kind of taboo. Like, you shouldn't do that. But I think it's becoming more and more popular to just straight up oppose that settlement of dual integrities. Not only did Calvin Robinson at Mere Anglicanism openly oppose the idea of women's ordination as basically equating it to transgenderism, and he got the pushback there from older, more establishment Anglican Church North America people. But then he was roundly supported. I feel like there was the kind of this weird populist uprising to defend Calvin Robinson, and I couldn't tell you a single Anglican news outlet or Anglican source that really stuck by and defended Calvin Robinson's removal. And in fact, a lot of people were really out there defending him, even though Calvin Robinson in his speech also really criticized Martin Luther, and people were hesitant about that, especially in some parts of the ACNA. Most people said, yeah, he shouldn't have got kicked out. That's a valid position he's allowed to hold and allowed to advocate for. And it's more and more popular. I think of, if you had to say who are the more vocal people who cover, and we'll get to this in a second, cover Anglican news, Anglican stuff on YouTube or whatever, right, which is the majority of the way that people, especially young people, are getting news about this kind of stuff. Well, I mean, occasionally I talk about that stuff, but barely. I would say Reverend Brett Murphy and Anglican Inc. Anglican Inc. is definitely a pro-Calvin Robinson association, and Reverend Brett Murphy is also. And both, I would say, even though Anglican Inc. shies more and more away from this, but Brett Murphy doesn't, just opposing women's ordination. And so there really is this weird kind of shift, this kind of bucking of the trend that I think people are confused by. And there was a clip on Anglican Inc. I love Anglican Inc., Anglican TV, all that kind of stuff. I actually listen pretty regularly to, oh gosh, I'm forgetting their names. Yeah, so it's Kevin and George, who, sorry if the transition was harsh. It's Kevin and George from Anglican Unscripted that I kind of think are interesting, because they, in some ways, represent kind of the old guard in the Anglican world, and there's this really sharp generational divide. Maybe I'll show one of the memes that I put. Maybe I'll show one of the memes that I made a little while back about this generational divide that got a lot of traction, because I think it kind of does betray the kind of truth of the situation here. But I think Anglican Unscripted is super interesting, and there's actually a clip from a recent Anglican Unscripted episode that I kind of want to go through. And maybe you can see how I'm stealing a little bit of the Paul Vanderklay way of talking about stuff. Kevin and George at Anglican Unscripted did a little interview with this guy, I'm forgetting his name, but who talked a lot about coverage of Anglican news. The whole interview is super interesting, and religious news in general, and kind of current issues. But there's this clip in here that I think actually has a lot to break down, and so I'm going to play it and stop and comment probably as we go through it.
On our 20th anniversary, and published approximately 15 million words of commentary. And at Get Religion, we had a trope that we called Anglican timeline disease. And what percentage of coverage of Anglicanism in the mainstream press have you seen that says it started with the ordination of a gay bishop in New Hampshire? What percentage would you say?
Well, I'd say 80%.
At least
Yeah,
80 to
yeah,
90%.
absolutely.
And this leads us to one of the primary problems in coverage of religion in general, but especially with coverage of Anglicanism, which is that everything is about LGBTQ plus. Everything.
Mm-hmm.
And since the press's analogy is that's equal to racism, you're plunged directly into a one-issue fight, which simply does not explain conflict in a global communion. Words like liberal and conservative don't do you a whole lot of good when you're trying to describe Africa and Asia and the global South. And I'm a huge fan of the Jenkins book, The First Christendom. Or was that the headline on the piece he wrote at the Atlantic? But you know what I'm talking about.
I do. Yeah.
He basically came out with the thesis that the future of Christianity was essentially in the global South, in Anglicanism, and I would argue Roman Catholicism, and certainly in Methodism, with Africa and Asia growing, while the churches of the frozen chosen in Europe and North America seem to be in decline. I think the single most important Anglican anecdote that I have included in my coverage, and I've used it a lot at Get Religion, but I got it in a column as well, comes from the venerable Bishop C. Fitzsimons Allison. And he was talking about one of those kumbaya meetings that they were trying to have to try to calm things down at a Lambeth conference. And the bishops from America and Europe were, things are positive, things are looking fine, things are getting better. We just need to learn to love each other and accept our differences, and essentially arguing for what I call theology by zip code. Or in an essay I wrote for Doug LeBlanc years ago, location, location, location. The most important thing in Anglicanism is what is your zip code, and what is the current identification of your bishop,
which is dual integrities, by the way. And so he's describing, I think, the older way of thinking about these issues in the Anglican world from, I would say, a group of Anglicans who came out of the context of being maybe even generational Anglicans. They've been Episcopalians for a long time. They've been a part of these Anglican communion controversies for the last couple decades, and all they kind of really want is peace, and they know that their bishop's okay, and they want to move forward. And I think that's kind of the position that we've inherited.
But anyway, Fitzsimons said that after a while, an African bishop grew very frustrated with this talk. And he leaned forward and he looked at the American bishop and said, "Where are your converts? Where are your children? And where are your priests?"
And he hammers that home, and I think that that's exactly right to do that, because it brings up the issue of replicability that actually I think underpins so much of these conversations. Why do we care about average Sunday attendance? Why do we care about membership? Why do we care about how many baptisms are happening? How many ordinations are happening? Why are all these things? Why does Africa care about America? Because in many ways, this African bishop that he's talking about is asking a very simple question that somehow seemed to kind of fly right over the heads of a lot of these Western Anglicans. Is he's just asking a simple question: in 2 generations, what's your plan? Like, you're not thinking long term about this. And that kind of dual integrities, location, 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 bishop, my bishop's okay attitude isn't that sustainable. And he's right to say that. And I think what's happening here is a contextualization. Africa realizes how important America is, and they know that if they want institutional success, that's going to have an American context. It's going to necessitate an American context. Stuff that's happening in America, they rightly understood, is going to have ripple effects throughout the world. So Orthodox Anglicans in Rwanda, Nigeria, Ghana, they weren't just going to sit by while the American church apostatized. They actively felt the necessity to replant Orthodox Anglicanism in America. Why do they think that? Why weren't they just okay with the Episcopal Church going its own way? And I think it's because there is a concept, in my opinion, that is hard to grasp immediately, but starts to make a lot of these conversations make sense the more you think about them. Okay, right. Jesus says to baptize all nations. So the subject, whatever, say you're a Credo Baptist or Paedo Baptist, we can put that conversation behind us. The subject of our evangelism is all nations. There are these things called nations, they exist, and all of them are what we're going to be evangelizing. The subject of evangelism is global, and there are no exceptions. Okay, that's the context of the Christian mission. But involved in doing that global context are nations, right? So there's this smaller subset. And even below that, the apostles, they don't just start, they go to cities. They want to find influential places in these nations to make impacts. And then they're going to say, this will be the community that I do well with here. Corinth is a good example. St. Paul goes to Corinth, thinks he's going to preach first to the Jews. The Jews don't really accept him there. He moves on to the Gentiles because he wants to establish a community here in Corinth that will have a social impact, that will have a contextualization. It will have an effect for the goal of evangelizing the world. He's thinking about consequences. He's thinking about what's important. And in my opinion, that's actually what's going on in the Reconquista conversation too. The Reconquista conversation is, look at a massive outsized effect of these mainline churches, at least historically, right? If they were on our side, we know that they would be doing an amazing thing for for evangelism. They have all this potential that they're not using. The problem is we're not the only ones trying to use that organism, in a sense, for our own ends. And they're also trying to use it. And the bigger the institution is, the bigger the subject of evangelism is, you might say, the harder it is to kind of attack wholesale. You have to bite off a little bit here, you have to bite off a little bit there, and kind of address that. And so you have to figure out, okay, what's worth my time? And I think it's interesting that to the African evangelists, they see America as one of those things. They see it as important. And they see the projection of power and influence as important. They obviously understand that you have to have a replacement birth rate to even be considerable for any scale, any sizable effort to evangelize. To kind of convert an institution. But again, these big institutions, they're wily, they're hard to contain. They need to kind of be pressed. I'm actually going to pull a clip out of the video that I commented on from Paul Vanderklay, I think, too, that might be helpful for this discussion. So in this, he's talking about the CRC's struggle to get leadership and talking about, is there a pastor shortage, is there not a pastor shortage, whatever. And then he goes on this little tangent about what it used to look like to create leaders, ministers, elders in the CRC, and maybe what's changed. And I think this will be really important.
Did some examinations, and then you could go into the system. But did some examination committee. The committee began meeting in late 2004 and has provided a full-time staff person in late 2007. The committee mandate is available on a document titled Journey Towards Ordination. Has been helping. This committee came about because traditionally young men would graduate from college, Calvin College or maybe Dort or another college, and then they would go to Calvin Seminary, and then from Calvin Seminary they would become candidates for ministers, and then they would become ministers. What began to happen in the 80s and 90s was that more and more Christian Reformed people who were interested in candidacy were going to other seminaries. And
that's had an effect. And that's kind of what he talks about in some other videos is, there used to be this idea that you bring all these people together, they'll sit in this box, and because they're together, they had a similar ethos, they had a similar way of thinking, and there was a kind of one-track idea, right? So until that moment, you have a kind of real serious CRC ethos, and he talks about this in other videos, but then since that kind of has changed, and you're going to other places, you're going to other seminaries, you're talking with other people, there's been a bifurcation, and the CRC now basically has to pick a way. They have to pick kind of evangelical, or they have to pick mainline, and that's a struggle for them because it didn't really used to be that way. And why is it that way now? And why isn't it always going to be that way? It shouldn't be that way, right? And why that was helpful, I think, is important. And then he talks later, and I can't find the clip right now, but I'm not sure it's exactly worth it. But he talks about people feel a pastor shortage, but there actually are a lot of pastors in the CRC who are looking for placement. But the places that are available are not places they want to go. Every CRC minister, he kind of points out, has this retirement idea where they'll go to Michigan, which is where there's a strong outsized presence of these people, where they can kind of live in CRC bliss. Does that make sense? Like, they can live in a place where everyone is familiar with them. There's a lot of Dutch ancestry. There's a lot of CRC churches available, versus like a high cost of living church plan in Sacramento or California, like he points out, might not be as appealing to a minister. And I think that this betrays. But why do we care? Why is that bad? That's kind of my thought. You're listening to this, you're like, okay, so why don't all CRC people or people interested in being CRC just move to Michigan, right? Why don't we just say, like, this is a Michigan denomination, and all of the Dutch ancestry kind of stays in one spot, and it would be like Calvin Seminary. There would be this kind of enmeshing of, like, this is our vibe, this is our ethos. It would be harder to kill, in some sense. Think about this: which Christian denomination in America makes the most disciples on average? There are two contesters for this position. I would say Pentecostals, okay? It feels like on our side of the internet that it's like, oh, everyone's can be becoming Orthodox or Catholic or whatever. But really, that's just a very small percentage of the population. Those communions are still actually shrinking on large, versus the Pentecostals are exploding in America, okay? And what are they doing? They've got this. There's no Pentecostal minister who's trying to go back to Michigan, if that makes sense. They're not limited. They're going out there. They're doing this ham-fisted evangelism. They're going to all these places, and they're low cost of operation missions too, right? They don't have to buy a tabernacle or all these kind of things to start a Pentecostal church plant. They can do that in a garage. And then on the other side, I would say, the Amish. And you're like, what? Okay, well, if you just look at demographics, in 2080, it's like more than half of the country is going to be Amish, allegedly. You can talk about controlling factors or potential for stagnation there, or like why that happens. But why? Because not a lot of people stop being Amish. Why? No one's really that introduced to not being Amish. And when they do, it's like this special once in a lifetime opportunity. Rumspringa, I don't know if you know too much about Amish people, but Amish people are centralized. That's the kind of word I'm kind of throwing out here. It's the word centralization. Amish people mostly live in Pennsylvania. They mostly live in Ohio. And they mostly live with each other. And they're limited in how far they can physically go, right? Think about how much modern transportation has changed the way we see ourselves in relation to other things. Like, I can drive basically the length of Pennsylvania in a day if I wanted to. And then, yeah, I could keep going. If I'm in Europe, I could travel these little countries on train all day and wouldn't take me that long. I could work in Vienna but live in Bologna, right? And that wouldn't be that hard. And I don't think it's a coincidence that you see like the EU kind of forming after that because it's feasible. You can see an institution operating on this level now technologically, or even communologically or sociologically, right? Because these connections now exist in ways they didn't before. But the Amish don't have that. So they don't broaden the subject of their evangelism, right? And it's not like that doesn't work, right? Nobody's asking the Amish, where are your children, where are your priests, where are your converts, right? I mean, maybe they're asking where are their converts. But my point is they're literally making disciples, right? If that makes sense. They're giving birth to them, and that's creating more disciples than most evangelists do. And I think that's so interesting because, that's just a plain power of your institution fact that you have to kind of reconcile with. That's why the African bishops don't just think, oh, let's get rid of, who cares about America, right? Not only because of the gospel, of course, but they realize, what does America have? Well, okay, I remember having a conversation with my bishop about a bishop in Rwanda that he was humbled by, who he found out he was the archbishop, I think, at this time. And it has since changed, and I might be getting some of the details of this anecdote wrong. But the Archbishop of Rwanda, the highest ranking prelate in the entire church of the Anglican Church of Rwanda made about $2,000 a year. You could not. I make about $2,000 a year on YouTube, for reference. Like, the economic proportions are not comparable. One church plant in the United States can make more money than that by tithing a very small congregation. And of course, the distance that $2,000 will take you in Rwanda is very different than it'll take you here, but it just goes to show the kind of economic disparity. And what are economics? Economics are resources. Those resources actually matter for evangelism. They matter for institutional relationship. Paul didn't ignore these things. He explicitly tells people that they have to support pastors financially, economically. This was not an unheard of element of ministry for the biblical authors. It's a part that we don't like to talk about. Maybe I can talk about it easily because I'm a layman, right? I don't have to worry about. I'm not asking anybody for money for my ministry, but gosh, there's a tweet that I'm going to pull up that I made a little bit ago that I think is interesting. Basically, I did some math on like the size of the ACNA and how much money the denomination has, and some of my math was kind of didn't check out a little bit, because if you think about it, the denomination as a head is actually really, really organizationally weak in the ACNA. The bishops, the dioceses are the really strong part. But just think about the economic potential is really what I'm kind of trying to hash out here. But basically, if the average Sunday attender in the ACNA tithed $5 every Sunday, okay, or $260 a year, the ACNA would make about $19,651,000 a year. It does not make that much. It straight up doesn't. The denomination as a head made about $1.5 million, which is sizable actually for a church. Most people don't do this, for whatever reason, but there's an enormous amount of economic potential in America. For reference, St. Peter's Cathedral in Tallahassee, Florida, which was built by the ACNA, cost $12 million. So that means they could build they could build a cathedral like St. Peter's Tallahassee every single year and still be making 5 times as much money as they make right now. If you think about it, right? This is a serious reason to think about it. What's happening now? What's going wrong? Why are all these other denominations declining? Should we all just become Amish? Like, wouldn't that be the best? Isn't this kind of the tension between retreatism and Reconquista that we've been talking about, and that Redeemed Zoomer is so interested in? On one side, there's like the Puritan model. They literally just left England, showed up in a new place, and worked really hard. And what was the difference? The Puritans are infamous for kind of their industrious capacity. So they were able to create economic resources, and then eventually it gets to the point where I think by like the 1810, the 13 colonies have a larger population than England. And even people like Benjamin Franklin will comment like the average American family during his lifetime had 8 kids versus in Britain it was 3. And that just, from a totally secular perspective, that just made them a more successful institution. And what's happening, I think, in lots of even Christian parts of America right now, and it's funny because I'm kind of an outsider. I don't have this kind of generational experience with Christianity and Christian America, but what's kind of happening, I think, is even those conservative Christian families who do have the 3.5 kids or whatever that would be necessary to keep up pace, there's a good amount of their kids that kind of fall off through exposure to, and this is the concern, I think, from lots of growing conservative Christians, is exposure to outside institutions are capturing our children, because we're realizing that we're not the only evangelists, right? We're not the only people that have a worldview we think will reshape the world for the better. So we're actually competing in all of these places, but we're not playing to keep, right? And think about this, okay? When you put something into the institution has more power to keep you in it already. It's a cycle. Think about a cult, right? The cults are institutions, right? And cults usually don't just kind of casually expect people to donate $5 a month to whatever their cult is, it's a high demand. Like, you've got to put in the effort. You've got to show up every time. If you don't, you'll be, socially ostracized by the people in the cult. It demands a lot from you. And in turn, because even though you're giving a lot in theory, if this was equivalent exchange, you'd be able to reap all the rewards from that. But it's not. The institution now has more power because you're putting in more power, put more effort and more resources, more money, more time into this institution. That institution has a stronger grip on you. It has a stronger grip on the people around you. And in turn, exposure to things outside of that very intense institution can rip you right out. They can give you a very jarring experience. I'll see lots of people who have stories about leaving Mormonism where it feels kind of like this. Mormonism has a weird tension where it started off with that kind of very high intensity, isolated community attitude, way of thinking about stuff. And then it kind of had to normalize itself in the context of American society, and kind of is always working to compromise on those ways of seeing themselves that makes it harder for them to map on to American society and see American society as a mission field, right? To see America as something that they can take as a whole, as one of those nations, and say, like, this is our subject for evangelism and our efforts, and kind of prioritizing downward and kind of breaking that apart in a way that's effective. So what's kind of going on right now, right? When people are talking about all these other institutions like the Roman Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church, a big difference, I think, with Eastern Orthodoxy, and again, Paul Vanderklay has a lot of videos on his channel that kind of go into this. It's peculiar. It's a very peculiar institution because it really used to be one of those inwardly focused institutions in American history. There was a Greek institution for Greek Americans, and that was the Greek Orthodox Church. There was a Russian institution mostly for Russian Americans, and they'll talk about some of his Orthodox kind of friends that he has conversations with. We'll talk about how the Antiochian Church, I think partially because they were a small group of immigrants, have always had a much stronger emphasis on evangelism to other people in America. And so they're having the same thing the CRC was having, right? Where it's like, oh, this was our context, but we're trying to broaden it. How are we going to contextualize ourselves? Because he's got another guy named Joseph that he talks about, who's also an Orthodox deacon, I believe, who basically points out, like, mainline churches, they've got a church for the most part in every zip code. The Eastern Orthodox Church doesn't. And, there are people in the ACNA who, ACNA right now has a rip-fire strategy for evangelism and church planting. And it's allowing us to stay afloat, right? Remember, the demographic average Sunday attendance is just staying the same. It's staying stagnant. But it's because a lot of the people who are in the ACNA now used to be Episcopalians, and they know the point of why it's such a valuable institution to be a part of. If you're in the Episcopal Church, if you wanted to be an Episcopalian tomorrow, it would just be so much easier for you. If you moved new town, you don't have to think, oh gosh, I'm going to go to, Aberdeen, South Dakota. I don't know if there's going to be a CRC church there. I don't know if a minister is going to want to plant in Aberdeen. Well, if you're an Episcopalian, there's an Episcopal church within driving distance of you in Aberdeen, South Dakota. There is. Same thing with being Roman Catholic. Now, does that mean that they're all your perfect box of Orthodox Christianity? No, because there's other people who are in that institution who don't have the same vision of what the eschaton looks like, and they're trying their best to evangelize that institution to that end as well. Versus, if you are Amish, there is no one trying to evangelize the Amish. There's no secular institution that's showing up at the Amish every day and saying, here's what your kids should think. That's not happening. So they have a full monopoly on their parishioners, and then their parishioners have a full commitment, appropriate level of commitment to that institution that they care about and they want to see grow. And so it keeps them in that institution. It keeps them gripped by it. In fact, the Amish are probably just actually, there isn't an overarching Amish institution, right? It's actually kind of a network of all of these tiny institutions who have a high buy-in and a high bandwidth. That is just, it's an inward focused agenda. What I think is kind of happening in the ACNA, right, is we want to replace the Episcopal Church. We want the bandwidth. We want the volume, right? Even the African members of our communion, even the Global South members of our communion realize, if the Episcopal Church, if we could have what they have, but do good stuff with it, it would be like, everybody in the world would be Anglican tomorrow, right? It's kind of how we feel. Okay. But what is also happening is you see a large influx of evangelicals into the ACNA because of liturgy and all these other things, and they've got their own agenda, they've got their own way of thinking, and there are kind of more Anglo-Catholic types in the denomination, in the global communion, who really resent the eccentricities of the evangelical converts to Anglicanism, because, quite frankly, a lot of it is very, and you can kind of see my frustrations with this in my video about, the Baptist case for Anglicans, right, or the Anglican case for allowing Baptists to be Anglican. It's like a really it's very dishonest to our tradition. Why? Why is it dishonest to our tradition? Why did this even happen? Well, evangelicals come into the denomination. They have the evangelical way of thinking. They're not even consciously doing this. They just have the way that they've been raised. The institutions that they've been in before have been doing that, reciprocal relationship of influence that we've been talking about this whole time, that's worked into their minds in the ways that they think, and then they end up in a new institution, and they can't help. But when they put the buy-in to have that effect on the institution, they're putting all this time and effort into being in the ACNA, and that means they want to see it do what they think is right, and the ACNA can't help as an institution to react to that desire. And so on the other end, you got the continuing Anglicans, who are basically the Amish, kind of the Amish solution, if you will. They're very focused institutions who are very orthodox on all of these issues, and they don't have the same problems. They don't have the struggle against other influencers. There's nobody going out there evangelizing to Anglo-Catholic churches, to APA churches. They don't have the reciprocal buy-in, and there's an advantage to that, but there's also a disadvantage, because it's actually it's a disconnect. The Amish are not really getting converts, but they are making lots of disciples, aren't they? In a different way. The Mormons aren't really getting converts doing door-to-door preaching. You do get a different class of converts. You get the class of converts that are not the class of converts that are going Orthodox or Roman Catholic. You get the class of converts that are going Pentecostal, and we can talk about that in a different video probably, but you do get some, but really, who is it for? It's actually the buy-in for the missionaries. The missionaries spend this time in the Mormon church doing all this stuff, and then they realize, this was my institution. I embodied it for 2 years. It's a part of my identity now. And it's that they put it in, and then in that sense, the institution has more control over them. It has more influence. It has more to say about them. And, people will see stuff like this, especially evangelicals, and they'll say, oy, control over me, an institution, that's not very Jesus. And you can say that, but then you, I think, end up in the place where you lose all of these people. You end up, in my opinion, in that place we're talking about, all those evangelical families who are having replacement birth rate, but they're just having so much fall off. Because when you're not thinking institutionally, you're not thinking about institutions. The institutions are still thinking about you. They're still thinking about your kid. They're still thinking about the public school. They're still thinking about what books should be allowed in the library. They're still thinking about what, because people will complain when certain, politicians say this book can't be in the library. Well, that's the only mutual relationship that the government or the people can have with the people who organize what books even end up in the library at all, positively, rather than just making a negative list. So you kind of have that tension between what you easily recognize as institutional, right? And in this book sense, it's like the government saying you cannot have this book in a library, public library, or in a school library, maybe, let's say. You can't have this book. You cannot, actively cannot, right? And then we all recognize, someone put up a prohibition, that's an institution doing something. It's like when the Mormons say you can't drink coffee or whatever, right? But what we don't see, and we don't categorize as institutional, but is the product of institutions, are what books actively, positively anyone even thinks about putting in a library. It's the Baptist case for Anglicans. That's an institutional consequence. That's an institutional consequence of the fact that we assume that this is not a big issue, credo baptism versus infant baptism, because we grew up in an evangelical milieu where it really wasn't an important issue. And the institutions around us told us that it wasn't. Gospel Coalition, it was Presbyterians, Baptists, side by side. They agreed to disagree on that issue and moved forward. And that wasn't a problem for that institution. And so that institution casually affected the people with buy-in in that context, and then the reciprocal process continued. What I think is going to be important, and why I do actually, people will criticize the Anglican Church in North America's rapid church planting stuff. In the interview, I think it was in the interview with my bishop, we talked about how there used to be like some 400 churches in the ACNA 10 years ago. Now there are like 900, almost 1,000. And that's allowing us to stay afloat. Why? Because if you can move anywhere in the country and stay Anglican, it will keep you in the institutional cycle to the point where you respect the institution and you keep doing the buy-in so that the institution can self-replicate, that it can keep doing this process. That's why these mainline churches have these kind of graying of the pews problems. And when I have conversations with Redeemed Zoomer, and he's like, look at just, if you actually pull the average Sunday attender at a mainline church, look how conservative they are. And trust me, I have lots of experience with the Episcopal Church, and I see that. I see that happens. And in a weird way, even though the Episcopal Church actually does have a very progressive layman population, I've heard that churches like the ELCA, right, mainline church, if they decided who should be the president in 2020, it would have been Donald Trump. How did that happen? If you just looked at the hierarchy of the ELCA, it just would not seem like that's what should have happened. That this institution is somehow failing, in a way. But really what it is you have all these people who don't care about the hierarchy as much because their identity, they've been shaped by this institution for so long that it's something that they couldn't abandon if they tried, right? Like those evangelicals who became Anglican, they couldn't abandon the institution if they tried. They could walk away from it physically, but it would still be in them because of all of that buy-in that they've put in previously in their life. And so that's why you see like the majority of these mainline churches are old folks because they have been in it long enough. But the way that they do church as a concept and evangelism as a concept and institution as a concept does not work on young people. The Episcopal churches I've visited in my life have almost no children versus the church that I go to right now, and most of the Anglican churches I've been to are full of children. And they're full of young families. And that works for them. The Orthodox church is doing both. And you're like, what? What happened was the Orthodox church used to be the graying of the pews mainline. The only people who attended these churches were the people who ethnically had the buy-in. They've been doing it for so long, it's second nature to them. The institution reciprocal relationship has been going on their whole life. And then for the younger people, that didn't work until it started appealing in some sense by being true to itself. It started appealing to a very an alienated class of Americans who had been already abandoned by the mainline actively and intentionally. And so instead of going back to the mainline, this class of Americans who are in some way elite, who are in some way institutionalized, they're a part of, for the most part, that small 37% of Americans who go to college, for the most part, who have enough time to spend on YouTube to even care about what the Eastern Orthodox Church is. That's a very small set of Americans, we have to realize. That segment of Americans used to be the bread and butter of these older institutions like the mainline church. Why? Because they're high buy-in, productive, educated Americans. They want to contribute to an institution. They want to have something to believe in, but they have to abide it. They have to respect it. They have to feel like this institution is doing something productive and valuable for society. And for the most part, this enlarging, this growing cast of of alienated elites don't feel that way about progressive institution, but they do still, you know. I wonder if there's a kind of retreatist instinct in all of us, because that same class are the same people who are still kind of retreating in a way. You'll see, funnily enough, in my opinion, Latin Mass for Roman Catholics is kind of the retreatism. It's kind of the OPC, if you will, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church of Roman Catholicism, and the Novus Ordo has kind of been abandoned because it's that same thing of there's too many people, there's too much buy-in to this from normies, there's too much buy-in to this from people with different eschatological visions. And that tension is always going to be there. And kind of wrestling with that, I think, will be hard. And the ACNA has to be conscious of this. Anglicans in America have to be conscious of this. Continuing Anglicans have to be conscious of this. And think about what's worth buying into. And what aren't you buying into? What won't have an effect on you? You know, I see so many people on here who complain about church. I get a lot of fans who are like, oh, I don't have to go to church every Sunday, but I hate wokeism. I really hate wokeism. And it's like, if you think those two things are unrelated, you're wrong. You're very wrong. If you think your battle against wokeism is a completely intellectual headspace idea, and that you will do it on your own terms, and you've got nothing to learn from previous generations of Christian believers, that you've got nothing to learn from an institution, you've got nothing to do, obligations, that's going to be hard. I think that's going to be hard to maintain. Yeah. That's been my rambling video. If you like the video, like the video. If you want to see more, subscribe. Hit the little bell button and you'll be notified every time I make a new video. If you want to support me, you can always support me over at younganglican.locals.com. Yeah, I'm Joe. Have a good day and God bless.